Hello and welcome to RADTV, not quite live at 5:25, CCTV, Chittenden County, Channel 17, Centre for Media and Democracy and Town Meeting Television. For those who have not seen our show before, RAD stands for Rights and Democracy, a grassroots people-powered organisation committed to creating an independent political movement for long-lasting change in Vermont and New Hampshire. Tonight, our subject will be tackling global climate change on a local level. If you like what you see this evening, please consider donating to RAD. You can find us at radvt.org and radnh.org. And you can, of course, watch our show on the fourth Friday of every month. I'm your host this evening, Tom Proctor, and as I mentioned, this month we'll be talking about tackling global climate change on a local level. What we can be doing, what we should be doing, and what we are doing in Vermont and New Hampshire. With me tonight we have just the one guest. Welcome again, City Council Member for Burlington's East District, Jack Hansen.
Thank you, good to be here.
Thank you for joining us this evening. Jack, I want to get going straight off the bat. I know that climate change is a central core issue for you. When it comes to your political philosophy, what you're trying to do in the City Council, what puts this issue above all other progressive issues, in your opinion?
Yeah, this is really the reason that I got involved in politics and that I have taken on this role as City Councilor. The reason that it's the most central role is because, frankly, because we've delayed action on it for so long, we now have to prioritize it above everything else. Because we have such a limited time to avert absolute catastrophe at this point. That's just the reality. If you look at the IPCC reports, if you look at the most recent science, we have a very limited time, probably a decade at most, to drastically bend the curve on emissions and seriously change the way our economy works and change the way our society works in order to avert ecological collapse. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty dire situation that we find ourselves in. However, it's also an opportunity to, like I said, transform our society, transform our economy, and as we address climate change, we can address a number of other issues that really stem from the ideology that is driving the climate crisis, which is also driving a lot of other of the issues that we face. Mm-hmm. So I think for those of us who really want to see change on a number of fronts, focusing on climate change and reducing our emissions and changing the way our economy works will actually benefit a lot of the other issues that we care about greatly as well. Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of trickle down, progressive initiatives, I guess. I'm
not sure if I would.
Right.
Do that, but,
maybe we shouldn't be invoking the spirit of Reagan on that one. So in terms of, because this is a global issue, and as you said, we are 10 years from potential catastrophic events, not just occurring every now and then, really occurring on a regular basis, and something we should be expecting for years to come. It often feels like there is very little we can do on a local level when we're looking at such a global problem. Mm-hmm. What is it, do you feel, that you're bringing to the table with Burlington City Council, mm-hmm. That we can do on a local level and it's going to make a difference on a local level when it comes to climate change?
Yeah, so I mean, this has to happen on a local level everywhere. Of course, we need strong state and federal policy. But regardless of what's happening at the state and federal level, we need to get off of fossil fuels on a local level. Even if Bernie Sanders gets elected and they enact a Green New Deal, I still don't think that someone's just going to come into Burlington and wave a wand and we're off of fossil fuels. Like, we're going to have to do that work regardless. It's going to be easier if we have support from state and federal level. But nonetheless, the work has to be done anyways. And we already know what the technologies are that we need to be using. So it's time to start making those transitions. And there's so much that we can do that already makes sense now, regardless of any broader policy changes. So we don't have time to wait, and the more we wait, the more that it hurts us in the long run. So we need to start acting at the local level. And beyond that, I think being a model, being one of the first cities, if not the first, to completely get off of fossil fuels, we can show the way for other places, show that it's possible, and also show what the benefits of doing so are. So I think it's critical. This is, like I said, this is going to happen. We've delayed far too long. Let's not delay anymore. Let's move at the local level. And let's be a model for cities around the country and around the world to do the same.
As you've said, the climate disaster could be happening in the next 10 years. In fact, it's arguably already happening. Australia just had their hottest day on record again just 2 days ago.
Yeah.
This is something that is ongoing. So how much on a local level is about prevention versus mitigation of the effects we'll see from climate change?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about climate change that I think often gets lost is, and this isn't just climate, it's so many other issues, but you're going to save money by addressing an issue up front and avoiding it, then cleaning up after the fact. And we're already dealing with this even in Burlington. Burlington, compared to a lot of places, hasn't been ravaged by climate change. Like if you look at a city like Miami, which is going underwater, and that, you know, that's even if we stop emissions today, Miami is going underwater. But so Burlington has experienced less of an impact due to climate change comparatively, looking across the country and across the world, especially at coastal cities. But even in Burlington, if you look at our winters now, and they used to be much colder, Burlington has experienced more warming than any US city. And our winters are much warmer than they used to be. And what we're seeing now is the freeze-thaw cycles. Every winter, we're going above and below freezing in our temperature many times. That used to not happen on a regular basis, and we're spending so much money trying to repair roads and sidewalks that are getting just totally destroyed by these freeze-thaw cycles. And, you know, water getting into cracks, expanding with ice, and just the cycle repeating over and over. It's very hard for public works to keep up with all of this. They're spending way more money to do it. So again, collectively, if we had taken climate change seriously early on, starting in the 80s, and we had taken incremental steps, we would have been able to avert a lot of the consequences. But now we're spending, you know, on major hurricanes, billions of dollars to clean up. And more importantly than the amount of money that we're spending to deal with the impacts of climate change, we've sacrificed certain parts of the world already. In the US, Miami, I think, is a good example of, because of our inaction, that city will no longer exist. Like, we have cemented that in, and low-lying islands, people are evacuating. Entire countries will be no more. So it's pretty disturbing that we knew that we could have prevented that. We knew that that was coming, but we could have prevented it. We didn't. And these people are being displaced and people are dying as a result of that. That paradigm continues. We continue to, you know, the more that we delay, the more parts of our planet and the more communities and cities that are sacrificed. So it's pretty disturbing that we're willing to continue to sacrifice places elsewhere. And I think in Vermont, you know, like I said, we're not on the coast, so we don't face necessarily as much risk as some other places, but are we really gonna wait until we're on the front lines? Like, we're gonna let these other places go? No, we have to take a stand. We have to stop emitting greenhouse gases, and we have to transition to a sustainable economy. But in terms of mitigation, we do have to do that as well, because although we're not going underwater, we're still facing some pretty extreme events. We did have Hurricane Irene that was pretty unprecedented in Vermont, the increase in precipitation, the freeze-thaw cycles that I mentioned. So we are seeing impacts of climate change in Vermont, and those are going to continue. We're not going to have the snowy winters that we're used to. We will in the short term, but in a couple of decades, if you look at the projections, pretty much all of the ski industry will it'll either disappear completely or at least be dramatically reduced. Maple trees are migrating northward, so the maple industry we may lose. So there are going to be some pretty dramatic shifts in Vermont, and we do need to prepare for that and create infrastructure that is going to be resilient so that we're not spending money on something that's going to be wiped away by the next weather event. So I think there is an important piece of adaptation and resiliency that needs to be incorporated into all of our decision making, especially around infrastructure. And so that needs to be in place. But I think the mitigation is even more important, because the less mitigation we do, the more adaptation we're going to have to do. So I think goal number one is to stop driving the crisis ahead through continuing to emit. And in Vermont, emissions are rising. So it's not even just that we're not going quickly enough. We're actually moving in the opposite direction of where we need to go.
Yeah, Vermont is set to miss its 2028 climate emissions goals that were set in 2007, I believe. And the levels in 2015 were higher than those in 1990. So there is certainly an argument to say that as emissions seem to be getting worse, not better, is the state taking climate change seriously enough? And what should they be doing that they're not?
Yeah, they're absolutely not taking it seriously enough. I think there are some folks in the state legislature who do take it very seriously, but the body as a whole and the governor, no, absolutely not. And if they were, emissions would be dropping, not rising. So I think the state bears a ton of responsibility for this. There has been progress in some areas, certainly. Vermont has been a leader in efficiency in our electrical sector with Efficiency Vermont and Burlington Electric Department, which is also an efficiency utility. Utilities across the state have been able to dramatically reduce electrical consumption. And we've also been able to create a power grid that runs primarily on renewables. So we have made progress in electricity, and we are a leader there. However, when it comes to transportation and heating, that's where you're seeing these increases in emissions, particularly in transportation. That's what's driving Vermont's emissions up, and that it's not only the largest source of emissions in Vermont, but it's where you're seeing the most increases. And most of the new vehicles purchased in Vermont last year, the vast majority of them were SUVs and trucks, right? So clearly efficiency that we've adopted in the electrical sector, we've not seen efficiency in the transportation sector. And so I think that really needs to be the focus. There are some things happening at the state level and being discussed that would have some impact in the transportation sector, but I would argue that it's not nearly enough. I think the goals that we've set in Vermont have been very strong, but we've missed them. So it's no longer time to set goals. It's time to actually meet goals and pursue action. And again, doubling down on transportation as well as heating. We have the technology. We need to adopt it. So for heating, we have advanced wood heating systems and also electric heat pumps. And we are seeing adoption continuing to increase for both of those. The transportation sector, we are seeing more adoption of electric vehicles. What I try to focus on is even more sustainable forms of transportation, especially in places like Burlington, where a lot of the trips that are taken by car actually don't need to be taken by car. They could be done on foot, they could be done by public transportation, by bike, and even a lot of the trips by car, it could be multiple people in a car instead of just one person. So I think we have a lot of work to do. We need the state to step up more, and we also really need to step up on the local level as well.
How do you persuade a nation, or not even a nation, a state or a city of car drivers, of SUV drivers, to start taking greener forms of transport, especially on a local level?
Yeah, so it's really about, what as a society are we prioritizing, right? Where are the incentives going? What options are we making more attractive and more affordable, and what options are we making less attractive and less affordable? In the US and in Vermont, there was a major shift, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, to start to cater all of our infrastructure and our urban planning and rural planning towards the idea that everyone is driving alone in their own car. That was how we shifted our transportation system. And it's going to be difficult to undo that, but that's what we need to do. We need to shift back towards a transportation system that is more efficient, costs less, and isn't destroying the planet. So a lot of it's funny, like a lot of the solutions, like rail as a form of transportation and trains, were actually commonplace in the 20s, and the US was a leader in public transit, including, state-of-the-art trolley systems across American cities, including in Burlington. We had an electric trolley system. But as the automobile rose and as car companies gained power, they dismantled that system and created their own so that they could profit, so that oil companies, cement companies, tire manufacturers, a lot of large industries, that there was a lot of money to be made by forcing everyone to spend $20,000 and over $1,000 a year on owning their own vehicle and maintaining their own vehicle and fueling up their own vehicle and insuring their own vehicle. So there's so much money to be made if you can convince everyone that they need to spend tens of thousands of dollars on personal transportation. And that's what happened. And that's where we're at. We're trying to shift away from that and get more cheaper and more sustainable options back on the table, trying to get more people using our bus system, trying to incentivize that. So in terms of what I mean, in terms of public policy and what are we incentivizing and not incentivizing, think about how much parking exists, right? I work at UVM, and I run a sustainable transportation internship program for students. One of the students' projects this semester was to look at a few different cities across Vermont and map using color-coded map, the amount of parking that were in downtown. These are the most dense urban cores, some of the most dense urban cores in the state. The number one land use was parking. It was dominated by parking. We're creating all of this parking, and much of it is just free parking, paid for collectively, even though it's for the benefit of individuals who use that system and who own a car. We need to shift completely in the other direction. So one of the policies that I'm doing, just to illustrate what I'm talking about, is to take money that comes in through parking revenue, comes into the city, so the parking meters across the city and the residential on-street parking permit program. Having money from that used to fund alternative forms of transportation. So that's kind of the approach I would like to take, is if you're going to drive your own car, society is paying a lot of costs that we're bearing collectively for you to do that. So why don't we disincentivize that? You should put some back because you're forcing us to bear that burden. And those of us who are getting on buses or walking and aren't forcing society to pay a large burden for how we move around should be better supported in those decisions. Yeah, right now we're subsidizing parking in highways and roads. We're subsidizing oil massively. All of these things that feed into car infrastructure. I'd rather see us subsidize public transportation and actually have folks who want to drive pay for the cost of that and not burden other people to pay for it. I think we need to flip the whole thing on its head.
And finally, what policies have you brought up to the City Council that you're trying to push through that you feel are going to address some of these issues that you've raised tonight?
Yep, so I mentioned one of them, which is looking at the true cost of parking and having folks benefiting from that parking actually be the ones to pay for it rather than subsidizing that. Further subsidies and investments in public transportation, so expanding fare-free public transportation. Right now we just have one route, which was the College Street Shuttle. It's called the Purple Line now, that is fare-free. Looking at expanding beyond that. We're eliminating minimum parking requirements because, again, we have been forcing, through policy, developers to build more parking than they actually need. And that parking goes into housing costs, so even folks that don't use it have to pay for it. What we're doing is saying there's no minimum, for downtown and along bus routes, there's no minimum parking that you have to build. The developer can choose how much parking they want to build. They have to decouple the cost of that parking from the housing though. So someone who just needs a place to live and doesn't own a car, now they won't have to pay for the cost of parking. We also, I've been pushing hard, and I'm hopeful that this will be incorporated into that same policy, transportation demand management requirements for new developers. So the developers have to actually, instead of providing all that excess parking, which the logic behind that was they have to deal with the transportation burden of their development. But this is a new logic of support folks who live in or work at your building to use other forms of transportation. So, for example, giving free or discounted bus passes to folks, having bike share or bike repair and bike parking available on site, having a car share pod for folks who don't own a car but maybe need to use one occasionally. So, again, doing things that do deal with the transportation impact of a new development, but not exclusively assuming that everyone should and will own their own personal vehicle. So that's on the transportation side, some of what we're working on. Also pushing for bike lanes on key corridors so that folks can get around safely by bike, because we do not have a network for that right now. Winooski Avenue is a key corridor, and that's a debate going on right now. And I'm going to continue to push for bike lanes on Winooski Avenue. So that's all in transportation. And then the next biggest area where we're emitting carbon and where we're using fossil fuels is in heating our buildings. So I'm pushing a policy around rental weatherization so we can button up a lot of these old and kind of dilapidated rental units and seal up some of the cracks and make sure we're not just wasting natural gas and wasting money and fossil fuels, and also pushing for district heating. So we can take a lot of the waste heat that's coming out of the McNeil biomass plant and actually pipe that into buildings. So I think reducing our consumption and then also either providing incentives, which we do for electric heat pumps, but also using waste heat from McNeil. So I think there is very much a pathway to be able to heat our homes without fossil fuels and get off of natural gas. And that's very doable. Transportation, I would argue, is more difficult But again, I do think it's possible. It's going to be a heavier lift, though. Getting folks out of cars, and then the cars that do need to remain, converting those to electric vehicles.
Well, I certainly wish you best of luck in making these changes, because, as you said, it's not only important, I think it's also up to Burlington to set that example. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll love to see you again at some point.
Absolutely. Happy to come back anytime, and thanks for having me on the show.
Not at all. Lastly, before we leave, I'd like to talk about our sustaining memberships. Please help us grow and win. You can become a sustaining member with Rights and Democracy and help us push progressive values like you've heard tonight all over Vermont and New Hampshire. So you can be rad too. Become a sustaining member today. radvt.org and radnh.org. We'll see you again next month right back here on Channel 17 in January in the brand new year, live at 5:25 on the 4th Friday of the month. This has been RADTV. I've been your host, Tom Proctor, and good night.